an Unspoiled Network podcast.
This is Spoil Me, covering Fullmetal Alchemist, Brotherhood. Episode 36, Family Portrait. In this episode, some weird red slugs come wiggling out of Hohenheim in the very first scene. It's the cold open. And then we just don't get to find out what that is by the end of the episode, which I resent deeply. They just, come out. Just out. Welcome to Spoil Me. Welcome to the show, everyone. I am Natasha. Thank you very much to Max for commissioning this episode. So, this is one of those episodes where I feel like if you are a distance away from watching this show for the first time, I could forgive you for thinking that this episode is where a lot of things sort of get revealed. And to a degree, that is true. But it's not really true in a material sense. What we get is a hint at a lot of things that are true that fly in the face of the preconceived notions we may have had. And by we, I mean me. And by have had, I mean still have, because as much as Hohenheim clearly is going through some shit, I still don't like him. And maybe I will come around on that, but at the moment, I just am eyeing him with considerable suspicion and feel as if whatever he is dealing with in this episode is likely the result of his own fuck up. And maybe that's uncharitable, but to be honest, as anybody who is in the Crowdcast knows, I'm in a bit of a fucking mood, and that is just where I'm landing, is not particularly charitable. And I hope that you guys can understand that, because I reserve the right to completely reverse my stance and do an about-face 180 and be okay, never mind, this poor man. The things that he has seen, the things that he has done. But as of right now, I'm just you know what? Fucking figure it out. Shut up. Get over it. Figure it out. And I sort of I feel like his wife is, her patience and the fact that she seems like a decent person indicates that I am wrong for my stance. Because I tend to trust her judgment for reasons that I can't explain beyond the fact that she seems nice. But there it is. We all have our snap judgments about things, and there's a lot of things that factor into those snap judgments that it can be almost hard or impossible to explain sometimes. And I am perfectly willing to admit that a big part of my feeling this way about Hohenheim is just the fact that he looks like a Brooklyn bartender. So there that is. But let's talk about this fucking opening scene, because truly, what is going on? He's saying names. So it starts off, Donatus, Poswell, Renmere, Gianni, Collins, Tony, Willard, Ripley, Mechthild, Mayo, forgive me, but I have to use you. And then he jams his fingers into his own chest. And I should mention, he is standing on the cliffside in this weird area that we have seen him before. And there is a map open on the ground behind him. So either this is for his future plans, and he was figuring something out before he decided to do whatever the fuck this is, or he is sending whatever these are to specific places on the map. As for the names, all I can think is that he has somehow absorbed the people like the way that envy has. I don't know how that could possibly happen other than like a really fucked up botched experiment. And I don't know what kind of botched experiment could result in something like this, because he, like, every kind of attempt at the kinds of human transmutation accidents that we have seen happen, nothing like this has been suggested as possible. So he jams his fingers into his flesh, which causes a gout of blood, and the drops land on the ground and turn into these little wiggly worms and disappear into the ground with purpose. It is not like they are absorbed into the ground like a liquid. They turn into wiggly worms and then go head first into the ground with the vibe of something that's on its mission to do a thing. And then we go to the house, and because of the fact that Hohenheim has not seemed to age at all, it can be really unclear for me when certain things are happening, and I am not positive that isn't intentional. It may be the goal for us to be sort of uncertain about what's happening when, but because when we go back to the house, he looks exactly the same, my instinct was to be like, okay, so this just happened. Like, he just said, okay, I have to use you. And he sends whatever these weird, like, little blood things are out into the world. And then he came home to see his kids. But it could also be that's present day. And then we're going back into the past, because it says like 13. And then there's like a character, a Japanese character, I'm assuming, that I am assuming that's like the year. And I don't see why we would go from a cold open and then get the year and it be at the same time as the cold open. So I think it's cold open is present, and then we are going back in time to a previous scene. So he is looking at his hand, and his wife is saying, you can hug them, you know. They are your sons. And he says, I don't want the monster to spread. And she says, if that could happen, I would have it, don't you think? So I guess, like, he's been rubbing up on his wife and hasn't really seemed all that concerned. And that's interesting. Why does he think that his sons are more vulnerable than her? Has it just not occurred to him? Like, is there something about her that would make her less vulnerable? A lot of questions. I have many questions. And then outside, he says, since I got this job, I've seen a lot of deaths, but I've tried to think of them as part of the flow of the larger world. That made it easier somehow. And each time I encountered something new and wondrous, it seemed right that I'd accept this body and keep on living. For a time, that was enough. But then I met you, and together we created 2 sons. Okay, so much. Together we created 2 sons does not sound like I impregnated you as a human male would a human female and you gave birth. This sounds weird. This doesn't sound like it was even something he considered possible. Like and then I met you and we did this thing. Like, there's a sense of, I didn't think this would even be possible when he says it. And I accepted this body. What does that mean? It seemed right that I'd accepted this body and kept on living. So what are you... Did you design this body? Saying I accepted this body sounds like somebody offered it to you, which sounds like either they made it for you, like a homunculus, which perhaps he is, I don't, or it was a body that was like dead that you took and continued to live in, or you had to take shape somehow and it just turned out to be this body and you were like, all right, fine, I guess. I mean, I am all for body acceptance, but this is ridiculous. Sorry, I really had to, though. I had to. And yeah, but then I met you, and together we created 2 sons. And again, he says we created 2 sons, but now he's afraid to touch them. So whatever happened before, it doesn't seem to necessarily have bearing on what's going on right now. Like, whatever he's afraid of at the moment, it seems is a newer development. And then he says, now it's different. I don't get any older, but my sons age and grow before my eyes. And suddenly I'm terrified that I really am a monster. I mean, I have no theory on this, because saying that he's probably a homunculus just feels too easy somehow. What he did, jabbing his fingers into his flesh and creating little blood spawns, that doesn't feel like a homunculus ability, but they all have very different abilities going on. So I can't even really say that with any sense of authority or understanding. All I can say is, like, if he is a homunculus, we are not given to understanding that they can have children. So if he were able to find a way around that, it would explain that he, like, his surprise at the fact that they managed to, quote, create 2 children together. But, I mean, because we know that there has been a plot in, what is the name of their country again? I keep wanting to say Alethkar, but I'm reading Stormlight Archive, and that's where that is coming from. And I know that this country starts with an A as well. And I'm sorry, guys, that I do this, but I am shocked at how little I mix things up, considering all of the different properties I'm covering. So I'm actually going to, like, give myself a break on this one. But the fact that they have been in power from the beginning, if it weren't for knowing that, I would sort of wonder if everything had begun with Hohenheim somehow. But it doesn't feel like that's possible. It feels like maybe Hohenheim was like part of the experimentation the way that Wrath was, but for whatever reason, like, he was never really a soldier, though. You don't get the vibe. And he wasn't raised, like, there's nothing to suggest that he went through the kind of, like, isolation and training that the Führer went through. I don't see that they would ever inject him with anything and then just let him go fucking get married and, like, live in the country. So that doesn't feel right. And, I mean, there's just nothing, I can't think of anything that makes sense here. I don't know. Let's see. Damien says, remember that father was also surprised at an owl were Hohenheim's children. Yeah, and that's the other thing, is the father looking exactly like him. Like, my instinct is to be like, oh, Hohenheim is the original. And then father was made as, like, a model. But what if I have that backwards and father was the original and Hohenheim was, quote, made in his image, as can happen? Or even an alternative to that is that they aren't either of them the original. They were both copies of somebody else. And there's either a third one or several. And they all look like that. And why? why would that even be a thing? You know, if we've got the theme going, the only one we haven't seen is Pride. We have a voice for Pride that felt like a little bit feminine, but we didn't see Pride. And for all we know, Pride could shapeshift the same way that Envy can shapeshift. I don't know. So my temptation is to like try and fit him in there and make him Pride, but I don't think he's part of that particular thing either. If he were, Father would have more of a connection to him and understanding of what's going on with him, but he feels extremely separate from it. So what the fuck? A mistress, thank you, be more. So yeah, this moment with his wife, she doesn't like contradict anything he says either. It's like she really understands a lot of where he's coming from, and she doesn't want to argue with him because the sense I get is she doesn't feel there's a good argument to be made. That there's nothing she could say that would particularly convince him, either because she knows enough about the situation to kind of be like, well, you're low-key right, or because they don't have enough information for her to make any particular judgment that would be convincing in an argument at all. But yeah, I don't know. So we have her calling him into this room, and it turns out that she is getting a family portrait done of all of them. We don't have a single family portrait, and he says that's pretty short notice. And he looks down at the boys crawling around and being absolutely adorable. And there's just this moment of like him not wanting to interact with them on a family level because he feels so anxious and concerned about it all. And she makes him hold Ed. And he looks at Ed and says, this isn't good. But then Ed like smiles at him and laughs, and he gets this like expression on his face like he never expected his son to be happy with him. And then we see this moment, you guys. It says, she's saying, what you don't see, dear, is that someday I'm going to be a wrinkled old monster myself. So today we're going to take this picture, and I'll be able to remember us all together smiling. No matter what, we're always a family. So even if you're scared, don't try distancing yourself from us. And one other thing too, stop calling yourself a monster. It's not true. And the photographer says, say cheese, everyone. He's taking it. Smile, dear. And we see the flash go off. And he's literally frowning with tears running down his face, holding his son like kind of away from himself in a moment that's like, I understand a little bit better why you might put a corner of something else over his face, because that doesn't feel like the energy we were going for. I really want this photographer to take another photo because this just doesn't feel like the one. I mean, I'm just saying you may want to do an extra just to be sure. This just, it's the flat out frown that he's got going on here. It's just like heartbreaking. And I know that it's supposed to be a moment of like, in a lot of ways, a happiness, you know, him. It's not outright happiness, but it's like an emotional connection. But if you aren't aware of what's like any of this that's going on, you would look at this picture and be like, wow, that's not great, you know? So then we see him in his office, and he's saying to himself, my plan was to take this body, and in doing so, to extend my life. But things are different now. And he's writing all of these things, and there's all kinds of crumpled papers all over his office that he has like tossed behind him because he's apparently trying to get something right, and he's not getting it right. And he says, but now I want to be with Trisha and the boys, to grow old and die with them. And we see him drawing a transmutation circle. And there's all kinds of writing in this to suggest that the transmutation circle is pretty big. Like, there's a signal to me that this is a sizable thing that he's attempting to set up and pull off here. And he sits back and then says to himself, "That bastard." And I'm wondering if he was, like, figuring out the whole thing with Amestris and the Führer. Like, if that was what was happening here, was him suddenly putting it all together and realizing what it was that they were doing. But yeah, he just pulls up, says "that bastard," and backs away. And then we cut to him falling off of a tree branch because he tried to, like, tie on the little swing for the boys. And his wife comes outside and is just like, "What you doing, buddy?" And he says, "I was fixing the swing. I haven't done much for the boys, but at least I can do this. I'm going away. Wait here for me." And she just says, "Okay." But I wanted her to argue, because the very previous scene with the two of them is her saying, "Don't try to distance yourself from us." And then he's literally going to put actual distance between you and him. And you just are like, all right, fine. Look, I'm sure there's plenty of, like, good explanation for it, but I just was kind of like, oh, come on, lady. Just argue a little bit. And she's putting the jacket on him and says, "Don't tell the children. I don't want them to know about my body." And she offers to wake them, but he says that he can't bear to look at their faces. And she leads him to the door with his suitcase, but the boys are awake because Al had to pee and Ed brought him to the bathroom. So they see him leaving, and we get a different perspective on this moment that Ed remembers really clearly, that we have seen from his point of view several times. And we know what Ed saw was this, like, uncaring, unfeeling, total bastard looking at them in this cold way as if he were like, ugh, as he turned and walked out the door. But then he sees them looking up at him, and you see his, like, eyes doing that thing where it's about to be cry time, and he has to, like, set his jaw and close his eyes and get control of himself, turns back to them for one last moment, and then walks out the door, having complete control over himself. Which, of course, years later gives the impression that he did not give a shit. It's really tough, guys. You want to, like, be in control of your emotions, but if you're in too good control, it's just not super helpful sometimes, even though we think it is. And I'm looking in the mirror as I say that, fully aware. So we see him next to a fire with the picture of his family and his, like, sad sack self. And he is looking up at the stars saying, "Just a little while longer." And then we get our credits. We come back. He is still sitting at this fire. And we just have this, like, one little moment. And then we go to the wall. So we've got a bunch of dudes who are underground and apparently trying to, like, figure out if they can communicate above ground. They're in that, like, tunnel that Sloth was busting through. And they've got a little phone in, like, a box. And this one guy is saying, there's still nothing coming through. And the captain, or I don't know what you would call him, says, "Oh, great. So we're cut off from all contact." And they ask him, "What should we do now?" And he says, "There has to be an exit somewhere to dump out the rubble. We'll keep going a little farther. Smith, go back and report." So Smith gets on a horse and he begins to turn around and go the opposite direction. The rest of all of these dudes are facing into, like, deeper into the tunnel. And there's a weird noise, and this dude says to everybody, fan out. And they're all ready, thinking that, okay, maybe there's another monster and we can take it. But then you hear this weird sound, and all of this darkness comes out through the tunnel, and we see streaks of teeth and eyes that look like the portal. It looks like that being in the portal, the eye that was in the middle of Gluttony's stomach. All of this for a flash. It's like a second. And then the blackness turns into knives the way that Lust's hands were able to do. And all of these dudes get fucking skewered. Their horses get skewered. It is really sudden and really brutal. And poor Smith, who had turned around and started to go like up the fucking tunnel, hears and turns around and is like, what? And he sees that thing coming toward him, and he begins to go as fast as his little horse can carry him. And we see the darkness swirl ahead of him, and the eyes and teeth twisting in the air in front of him. And he screams, and then we cut to Ed and Al listening in on the conversation with Armstrong and Raven. That was really intense, guys. There is something about it being... One, it's such a big group that gets got here. Two, it's unclear what this is. Like, it's obviously something related to the homunculi and the portal. But it's not like... I thought for a moment it was going to be Lust had come back. You know, I thought that... Because we know that they can sort of be brought back and recreated and whatever. So it was a weapon that was so similar to Lust's. And I was just like, oh, Lust is back. And then you see the streak of the eyes and the teeth. And I was like, wait. And the fact that it's an unknown makes it more unnerving. Also, the fact that they are so separated from everything that nobody is going to know what happened for a long time. Like, there's a combo. One, nobody knows that it has happened when it has. Two, nobody is going to know that they are all dead until they like get to... And I'm assuming they're dead, and they may not be, but I truly don't see how they survive being impaled the way that they are. There is blood flying. It's not like this is a spiritual attack. This looks like a physical effect. And three, the fact that they are so deep that in order to find them, you have to be willing to put yourself in the same danger that they were in to get to them. You know, this is a classic thing with rescues in general is I go underwater to try and save somebody and I risk drowning. I go to the mountaintop and I risk falling. You know, there's everything that we have to do to get to them is sort of following in the footsteps of the very people we're trying to save, which feels like I'm just setting myself up to have the same fate that they all have. So all of that is already just really like, oh, and then we've got poor Smith who's on a cantering horse, and this thing outpaces him with no problem. It isn't even a question. He doesn't almost get away. He is nowhere near an exit, and this thing has already cut him off. So there's just no chance that anybody we know of, that if they went down there, not a single one of them would be able to stand up to this thing and keep it from hurting them, as far as we know. And just between all of those, it just feels like we have stepped into like a slightly different direction in terms of the stakes for me, because I have felt very confident Ed and Al in any conflict that involves the homunculi, they're going to look out for him because he and his brother can't be sacrificed too early. And I remain pretty confident that's still the case. It's just that this thing feels like it could maybe not care and just do what it felt like anyway. It's hard to know how connected this thing is to everything else that's going on. Because I have this assumption that the being in the portal is allied with the homunculi. And I really don't have any reason to think so. The only connections really are that like Father tried to create a similar portal in Gluttony's belly and failed, and they wound up with that weird sort of in-between place. But if the thing in the portal were connected to the homunculi, wouldn't it be able to help Father create a successful portal? Why would he need to make a shortcut, another version of it, if they were in league with each other the way that I'm thinking? I wouldn't assume that he would have to do any of that. So, as far as I could tell, this may be a completely separate attack, a totally different issue. I don't know. I really just, So, going back to the scene with Raven and Armstrong. This dude is leaning so close to her. You guys, I really thought. He's got his hand on her hands. Come on. Right? Come on. Right? That's exactly what it looks like. Am I wrong? I mean, this man, I don't like it. And I love it. He says something like, I know you want this, this immortality as much as I do. And we get like a flash of her, like, with this like expression and her eyes glowing. What I want is to kill you! But she's keeping it inside. It's such an incredible question. I don't know what to say. Well, are you interested or not? There's only two answers. And he's holding her hand in his, in this way, like he's proposing or something. And she says, General, it is intriguing, but can you tell me, on the day when this dream comes true, will my men share in this gift, or is it only for me? And he says, I can tell you when the time comes. So she's realizing that she can't say no yet because she doesn't have enough information for it to be worth putting herself on the table like this and then just saying no right away. But if she says yes, she's going to have to be part of whatever creepy shit they're doing. And she doesn't know. And like, if she says no, she'll be demoted and moved and, So she's sitting there trying to decide whether or not to accept the offer, and they get interrupted. And it's the news about the poor guys in the fucking tunnel. He says the underground advance team, they are out of communication. Something happened to them. And I wanted to mention this before. They call her Sir. And far be it from me to really give a shit about like the gendered wording in principle. But I have to bring this up because this is something that also happened on the Magicians TV show. There is a character who, her name is Margot, and spoilers for the Magicians TV show. Margot becomes a powerful ruler, the most powerful ruler, and they call her king. And it really bugs me that in order to indicate a woman has true power and true respect, we use male titles to refer to her because that's the way to really indicate strength. I don't appreciate it or like it. And it bothered me a lot with Margot because she is a particularly like feminist character. And for her to accept being called king as a mark of respect and power instead of arguing that they felt the need to go in that direction at all, always sort of bothered me. And then here, for them to call her Sir, I don't know if this is just a translational thing, but I feel like the dub tends to like sort of Americanize things a little bit. And if it were, it wouldn't do it this way. So I feel like that must be part of like the text and somewhat important to the fidelity of the text, the manga, the original. And I don't know if I'm reading too much into that, but it's just something that I've been noticing. Is like to really establish that a woman holds the same kind of respect among her peers. She has to take on male titles, which are taken as the default epitome of power. And it just, I don't like it. I don't appreciate her being called Sir and seeming to think that that means that she's somehow exceptional as a woman in her position. It feels shady. So just needed to say that. But yeah. So Raven says that he's going to come with them. And Ed makes a bunch of rope in the little room that they've been listening in on so that him and Al can get tied up and look like more convincing prisoners. And they pass Buccaneer, who's got Miles, who's got Kimberly, passes Buccaneer, who has Ed and Al. And they have a moment of just like, hey, what are you doing? And Miles explains Kimberly is Raven's honored guest. And Ed recognizes Kimberly and is like, what? And I love Kimberly hears the Elric brother's name, and he looks at Al and thinks that he's the Fullmetal Alchemist, which again, I can understand why people make that mistake, but it was just not my interpretation the first time that I was watching. I assumed Al was like an automaton sidekick thing. And that, granted, was because I didn't know about the universe and whether that was even possible. And I assume Kimberly isn't thinking that's possible. So it makes more sense for him to assume what he does. But it is really funny to have like that callback to the moment and Ed be so annoyed once again that people keep making that kind of mistake. I see. Now I understand your nickname. And I love when Ed gets annoyed about it and Al seems like embarrassed on his brother's behalf, and Al just turns into like the weird bullet-shaped piece of metal with a face on it. Like he's no longer this suit of armor figure. It's just he's just sort of an amorphous blob, and I always find that really, really funny. So we see everybody standing around this hole, and, it's all down near the tunnel where Sloth came out. And they say that Smith's horse returned, and it came back with what we assume was his arm. And she says, where's the rest? And he says it's still missing, and his horse can't lead us back. It's too terrified to be of any use. And we see the horse is like tied up on this sort of area and yanking on its bridle and wants to get the fuck out of Dodge. And Armstrong starts to be like, okay, we need to organize a search party. And Raven interrupts and says, you can't do that. That tunnel is too dangerous. What have you done with the monster you were telling me about earlier? And she doesn't say anything, which I thought was sort of interesting because I wasn't really sure. She knows that he knows about it, so I wasn't clear what she was afraid of in telling him. But what he wants to do is put Sloth back in this tunnel and then seal the entrance up. And I am not certain why that's what he wants her to do. Like, it seems like he kind of knows what's going on here, but I hesitate to believe he knows that much, and I don't know why, but there's a feeling of some kind of superficial understanding from him. Like he has been told exactly as much as he needs for his greedy ass to want immortality, but not enough to really know what's going on, really. And again, that's just like kind of an assumption I'm making, but I feel pretty confident about it. But yeah, basically what I'm going with is kind of, he just wants to cover this the fuck up and like pretend like it never happened, pretty much. And I don't know that, like, if Sloth was digging this hole, Sloth was sent to do something. Throwing him back in and sealing the entrance doesn't sound like that jives with whatever it was Sloth was sent to do. So I feel like that's not the move. But what do I know? So yeah, he says, I know Northern law, obey strength and obey the power. Isn't that the way it works? And we get, guys, this amazing, because we go to a title card in the Fullmetal Alchemist, and we see Raven. You guys, the face that this man is making. Hold on, I'm going to screen share this. It is so funny because he does not make this face at any point during this episode. But do you see this? Like, why is it? Do you see it blinking? Oh, okay, there it goes. But yeah, isn't that the way it works? And then all of a sudden, it's just like, and then back to the show. It was just such an abrupt, like, cut, and his face looks so bonkers that I had a moment of just, wait, who is that? And then I realized. So we go then to Ed and Al in their cell, and they are being informed of the fact that, first they have Raven showing up and being like, hey, glad to hear that neither of you boys has divulged anything. And they're like, well, that was the deal. And Ed and Al are like, well, can't you let us out now? Because we want to continue with our search. Like, why are we being held at all if it seems like everything is fine? And they say, if the deal was, we didn't mess with you, you wouldn't mess with us. And he says, there's no need to worry. I'll let you out of here soon. And Ed thinks to himself that the tunnel is part of whatever you're planning. I've already spoken with the general. She's going to put the homunculus back underground and seal up the tunnel's opening. General Armstrong's on our side now, Fullmetal. And both Ed and Al react as if they believe him. And I don't know if that's just for his benefit, but it really struck me as like, this is something that happens in stuff sometimes where a person needs, like, for example, with Harry Potter. Harry is trying to communicate via a fireplace and gets caught, right? He gets caught by Umbridge, and all of his friends and some enemies are in the room, and Snape comes in, and Harry tries to give Snape a coded message and says something like, they have Padfoot in the place it's hidden. And Snape, to maintain the air of subterfuge and vagueness, just says, I have no idea what he's talking about. And Harry gets so, like, angry and horrified. And it was like, Harry, you know that he can't reveal that he knows what you're saying to him in front of the enemy who would prevent him from doing anything. You have to be aware that isn't what he would do were he to understand you. And so in this moment with Ed and Al and their reaction to Raven saying she's on our side, it felt like they were buying what Raven was telling them. And I was like, guys, the whole point of this is for Armstrong to pretend to be going for his bullshit to get info out of him. So of course he thinks that she's on their side. There's no reason for her to You know, like, it was just a weird moment where I'm like, you guys seem upset that things are going according to plan. You have to know that this is according to plan, right? You know? But anyway, it doesn't wind up mattering that much. But I just like, it was a moment of them looking panicked. And I was like, this should be good news. So this dude, Henschel, keeps on yelling to Armstrong, like, we have to go down there and rescue them. And she just finally tells him to shut the fuck up. And Kimberly is watching this and is like, oh, wow, they say that she's really fucking tough, but apparently she's listening to the things she's being told to do, and that is the smart way to go, usually. And then we see Sloth being brought in, and he's, like, on a pallet, and they get a forklift to, like, carry him over to this place. It was, honestly, I keep forgetting how fucking huge this dude is. And I thought it was interesting that Raven just calls him Sloth. He straight up addresses him by name. I understand that Armstrong is on your side, but none of these other dudes know what's going on. Why are you revealing yourself to them? I don't know. It just felt sort of weird. It's fine. So he tells Sloth, you better wake up. There's still a lot of work to be done here. Pride explained it to you, didn't he? Again, Pride. What's going on, Pride? So Sloth says, I guess. And he gets up and he heads back over to this tunnel. They've constructed like this big sort of scaffolding around it, and they've made it a tidy square, because they are going to be filling it in and making it sound, I guess, is the word I want. And so he says to them, to all the soldiers, he is a chimera who's been helping to make this country even greater than it already is. Of course, it's still a top secret operation, so close this hole and guard our secret. I'm counting on you, soldiers. It's people like you who make this country what it is. I guess. Man, this is just such... This is like the kind of rhetoric that sounds so corny in a show until you realize that this is the exact kind of corny rhetoric that's out in the world. It's just like... And... he's just telling this huge room of people, hey, keep our secret. And I was like, man, they just lost like 15 people in that fucking tunnel. I would not be counting on their discretion were I you. But that's your decision. This dude is just... he's blissfully confident in a way that feels unwarranted to me. But you know what? A lot of guys like him operate that exact way, so that's fine. So we then cut to Mei Chang and Dr. Marco, and he is like looking at this journal still, and he's saying all the important parts are written in ancient Ishvalan, and there's no way that I can read it. If Scar were here, he might be able to read it because he was an Ishvalan monk. And Scar and guys, Yoshi, I do this every time, but they are they're being spied on by a couple of soldiers who are like, oh, there she is, the girl and her weird cat. And for a second, I really thought for some reason, Yoki, thank you. I really thought that this was them, that this was Scar and Yoki, and I was like, there's no reason for me to have thought that at all. But they both get knocked out by Scar, who sneaks up behind them and is like, absolutely fucking not. And the two of them come in, but we don't see what he did with the bodies. I mean, I'm assuming that these guys are dead, because they've been stripped of their clothes. So they're going to freeze to death. But they, like, there's uniforms for each of them to pretend like they are with whomever these guys are with. The Briggs soldiers know where we are. We've got to move. And, I mean, the Briggs soldiers, like, these two dudes know, but they're dead now. So, I guess it makes sense that if these two came and then they don't come back, they're going to be noticed to be missing and then they'll pursue them. And this is when we go to the filling in of this hole with concrete. And we have this fucking... Raven is laying it on so goddamn thick, and I am not talking about the concrete. He's like, we're the chosen ones that will receive immortal, near-godly bodies. There was nothing we could have done to save those men. And they aren't part of the chosen ones. They'll be sacrificed. Survival of the fittest. The weak will become the foundation of the country, and the strong will take their rightful place on top. And she asks if that's what happened in Ishval. And he says, indeed, they were part of the plan. They were weak and deserved to perish for the good of their betters. And it's just so funny because he's like saying all of this shit with no attention paid to the expression on her face or the tone in which she's asking these questions. And she is glaring at him. And I was like, ooh, girl, what are you going to do? And we see what she's going to do pretty shortly. We cut to Kimberly here. And he's got a phone call where he says to somebody, I understand and I'll take care of it. And then he comes back and is walking with Miles. And Miles is asking him about all of these phone calls. And Kimberly says, I need to talk to Raven. And all of a sudden, Miles stops walking and says, okay, look, I saw your injuries. You were fucked up. And you're walking around and you're fine. What the hell, dude? How did this happen? How can you do this? And Kimberly is like, none of your business. And then, well, you were killing police. Why would they release you? Also, none of your business. And then we go to Raven again. This dude, I'm grateful for your assistance. You're a true servant to your country. I'll speak to my superiors about preparing a seat for you. And he puts his hand on her shoulder and like rubs it back and forth. And it just really feels like he is assuming that because he brought her into the fold, that means that he's going to get her. There's just a real strong vibe here, you know? I'm just saying. And she says there's no need. And then her sword goes through his arm that was resting, like, his hand on her shoulder. Honestly, that is so fucking satisfying. If I could put a blade through the arm of every man who had touched me when I didn't want to be touched, there would be a lot of handless men out there. Let me tell you. So she does that. And she says, growing old is truly terrifying. You would know before you became so afraid of your own mortality. I'm sure long ago you had an earnest concern for your country. And he's saying, you were going to be one of the chosen ones. You would have been one of us. I don't need a new seat from you. You're going to lose the one your moldy ass has clung to for far too long. Yes. 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 Term limits. Term limits. I love this. She calls him, you old traitor, and he starts to draw a gun, and she is too fucking fast, and she slices him all the way down the front, sending him careening into the pit of cement. but immortality was right before our eyes. You are among the weak who will become the foundation for this country. Literally. I was going to be him. And he gets swallowed by the cement, and where his face was, she tosses in the gloves that she was wearing when she wiped the blood off her blade. This bitch is everything. I love it so much. And you know what else I love? All these dudes standing around watching her capitulate, being like, what the fuck? And what a relief this must have been to all of them. Because they were like, I was trusting this bitch, and now what is happening? And then she draws a sword, slices this man up, throws him into the cement, and they're like, okay, yes. See, now this makes sense. I was really worried for a minute, but good. Now we're back to the way we are. But yeah, this whole moment is just so deeply satisfying. So she tells Buccaneer, she's like, hey, by the way, go and tell Miles that there's no need for us to, no need for him to keep buying time anymore. So that's why Kimberly and Miles are having this weird stilted conversation, is to just keep Kimberly out of the way. Unfortunately, what we find out is that Kimberly is under orders to fuck this entire place up if anything gets done to Raven. So if they can keep from him that Raven is fucking dead, that's fine. But they're trying to say, oh, who knows what happened to him? And I don't feel like that's going to hold up for very long. It sort of seems to depend less on whether they can keep him from finding out Raven is dead, and more about whether he feels like fucking their lives up. Because if Raven is just gone and nobody can find him, you can pretend you don't know what happened to him all day long. But Kimberly is the one that's going to decide whether or not that is suspicious enough to act on. I feel like it's just kind of down to his mood, you know? So yeah, Miles is like, well, it's not real safe to be wandering around if anything happens to the general. And Kimberly interrupts with, well, I would welcome it, because if anything bad should happen to him, I have permission to act in whatever way I see fit. And that decision came down from the Fuhrer himself. Now, perhaps you could provide me with a car to drive me down the mountain. I'm hoping that if they just get him out of here, they don't need to worry about him interfering anymore. I mean, and when he says it's in your best interest, I promise, orders from me are tantamount to orders for the Fuhrer, I felt like what he was saying really was, it's in your best interest to get me the fuck out of here so that I don't find out whatever it is you did, because I'm highly aware that you pulled something. You know, that's what I got, but I don't know if that's actually true. So it turns out that there is another entrance to this tunnel that they didn't know about. And she says Fullmetal saw this coming, and he made us this secret passage into the tunnel. So yeah, we are going to go after our guys. And I love the look of joy on this man's face. He is so excited that they're going to pursue their friends, their comrades. It's such a nice moment. I mean, we know they're all dead and this is not going to be good, but it's so fun to see somebody who for a moment completely lost faith in somebody that they admire and obey. And then they realize that, oh no, they completely had all of our backs actually. This is great. So yeah, we get a report to Ed and Al about the fact that Raven was killed, and the guy doesn't tell them anything further. They ask when they're going to get let out, and he's just like, nah, and leaves. And, I love Al just is like, man, let's just rest. There's no good getting yourself mad over this. There's nothing to be done. And Ed is like, I can't just sit here. I need to do something. And then Kimberly walks in. I was wondering, could I have a word with the Fullmetal Alchemist? You shouldn't dislike me. You should be grateful. I brought a visitor with me to see you. And it's Winry. Where the hell did she come from? We saw Kimberly's whole journey. What happened? Or was the car to bring him to pick her up? Is that all it was? She was like on the train? I guess me saying it's in your best interest to send me in that car, it can't mean what I thought, because he just like, it was just an errand. It wasn't to take him away. That's annoying. And both Ed and Al, of course, are just like, what are you doing here? And she's like, your automail, it needs help, obviously. And she's sort of like, understandably offended at the fact that they both seem really unhappy that she's there. She thought that they would be delighted and appreciate the effort that she's going to, and appreciate that she was worried about them. And instead they're both like, what the fuck? Get out of here. And Kimberly says, the Fuhrer was concerned about you and wanted to be sure you were taken care of. And that is where the episode ends. But there is a post-credits sequence. And I actually remembered this time, everybody, so please be very proud of me. But it's Roy, and he is in the back seat of a car. He is with this girl, a woman, forgive me. And she's giving him information. I heard it from a friend of mine who's working as a nurse at the base of the mountain. She says he was admitted with serious injuries, but after General Raven came to visit, he recovered right away. And he realizes that something is afoot. He says, thanks, and tell me if you hear anything else, and gives her an envelope, which I'm assuming is full of money, but it might also be a message. She gets out of the car and says, it was really nice seeing you. And they make it all look like it was a date. And then there's this old lady who's got all these flowers. And she's like, nice seeing you. That doesn't really sound like anything, which was honestly kind of funny. It's not like, she's not wrong. As a matter of fact, it turns out it isn't anything, but it is a funny moment of her just being like, that's not what you say when you want that dick, I'll tell you that. And he says, I'm better off without her. Thanks anyway. And she pulls up some flowers and she says, I have a message for you from Olivia Mira Armstrong, Colonel Roy Mustang, right? And he says, I'll take every flower you have in that cart. And then that is the end of the post-credits scene. So he knows some of what's going on. I really enjoy all the secret messengers. I'm a fan of all of this kind of thing. Big, big fan. So this is a fun episode, but I also just desperately want to know what the fuck with Hohenheim. And I have no real estimate about how long it's going to take for us to get that information. You know, there are times where you feel like this is clearly a setup so that I'll get the info next episode. But I don't think that doesn't feel like what's happening here. I feel like I got this and I'm going to get 4 more episodes unrelated and then maybe we'll go back to him. I don't know. But obviously whatever's going on with Hohenheim, he got what it is that Raven was after. Raven wants this body, and Hohenheim has that kind of ageless body, immortal, unaging, undying. And he didn't want it. He wanted to get out of it somehow, which I don't know how one would even do that. But whatever the pursuit of immortality meant, obviously it was possible to achieve it already. It's just unclear whether or not, and especially Hohenheim has all these names that he calls when he jams his fingers into himself. So for me, that feels like the foundation for the stronger, like these people are somehow fueling his immortality, like their souls, but I don't get it. Michael says, I estimate fewer than 28 episodes until the reveal. Thank you, Michael. That is very, very helpful. B. Moore says, I love this era of history where there are things like trains and phones, but it's still limited to a degree and information can still be controlled, hidden, restricted, unreliable, etc. Project Valkyrie was a good movie based on the concept. This is such a thing, like, that exact sort of, what's the word? The limits of this kind of technology is exactly why so many fantasy series are set in like the 20s, because you can have cars, you can have phones, but nothing is quite good enough to be completely relied on. It's not universal enough to be accepted that it's available anywhere. And it's just like constantly used as a sort of time period in a lot of fiction for that exact reason. We're covering the Wax and Wayne Mistborn books, and that's the same kind of setting that they are in there as well. And it lends itself to a lot, because then you can also include like sort of steampunk versions of things that existed in the 20s, but make them like slightly cooler or slightly worse. There's a lot of freedom to be like more creative with it and still keep it recognizable. So yeah. All right. I'm going to wrap. I'm over time, but thank you guys again very much for hanging out with me. Max is I didn't even see you were here, Max. Hi. He's asked if I watched the after credits. I did. I remember this time. But I really don't have enough to go on for a solid theory. So I'm very, very interested. All right, everybody. I will see you on Friday with a new episode. Until then, toodaloo, motherfuckers.
That was an Unspoiled Network podcast.